So this first proposition is that the fear of death is born of ignorance and not wisdom. So having provided some context to our discussion, I'd like to delve more specifically into these epistemological and ethical questions and that Socrates raises and addresses regarding death. And in this first passage, as I've noted in reading about that proposition, he's addressing the fear of death. And the fear of death has both, for Socrates, I think, is born both out of erroneous epistemological and ethical and practical assumptions that are somewhat interlinked. So maybe I'll just briefly go over this passage, and then I'll offer my own comments here. So Socrates says in the dialogue that to fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. Socrates says no one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. And Socrates then says, and surely it is the most blameworthy ignorance to believe that one knows what one does not know. It is perhaps on this final point, and in this respect, gentlemen, that I differ from the majority of men. And if I were to claim that I am wiser than anyone in anything, it would be in this, that as I have no adequate knowledge of the things in the underworld, so I do not think I have. I do know, however, that it is wicked and shameful to do wrong, to disobey one's superior, be he God or man. So he continues on with his speech there, but I would just like to highlight that part of the speech because I think that touches upon some of the key issues, I think, that are relevant to understanding what it means to meditate upon death, how that impacts one's conduct in life. I think what he's getting at here is, with regards to the epistemological assumption, is that what Socrates is saying is that to fear death is born from the false belief that an individual might confuse as true beliefs. So, for example, that death is bad, that death or the process of dying produces suffering, that the reality of death cheapens life, and so on and so forth. So he thinks fear of death it seems to me, according to my reading, it seems like it's based upon those false beliefs, those false assumptions. And Socrates seems to be suggesting, that it's a vice to engage in that type of thinking. And so there's a lot going on here. I think Socrates in this passage is addressing some of the questions that I brought up previously in sort of introducing this discussion. But this ethical question that it raises is, what is the appropriate attitude toward death? And the appropriate attitude toward death, I think, is to never fear or avoid death, since death is an unknown, and one should never fear an unknown. And what I think Socrates seems to be raising in this passage is that this ethical question of how should one conduct oneself in regards to the reality of one's death, and some practical wisdom, which I think can be extracted from this passage, is that are several practical precepts which I think could be helpful in coping with what's going on. And the first precept here is do not believe that you know what happens when you die, since you cannot know this. I think this belief might be practically useful insofar as false beliefs regarding death and the afterlife may have maladaptive consequences. So, for example, if one believes that one will be punished for one's sins upon death, for example, in some kind of hell, then this may lead to a sort of a generalized sense of fear towards death, which could serve as the root of other fears. Another false belief could be the process of death and dying would be painful and lead to suffering, and therefore it's something to be dreaded. Another false belief might be that life is inherently meaningless because one will die. So that's more of a nihilistic belief. So I think that we could generate, a list of more beliefs that could be maladaptive. So I think Socrates is admonishing us, not to believe in such things as those, because such beliefs are maladaptive. And the question too that it also raises is this epistemological question. Can a person know what happens when one dies? And Socrates seems to be saying no. And he also seems to be pointing out the limits of human knowledge. We do not know what fate awaits us upon death, nor do we know what will be awaiting us in the underworld. So he seems to be getting at that as well. And so, there's a lot going on there. And what I think he's trying to say is that someone who fears death lacks both wisdom and knowledge. And by extrapolation, someone who does not fear death would be someone who possesses both wisdom and knowledge, I think. So a question I want to ask is, what might this wisdom and knowledge be? And also, I'd like to briefly touch again on the epistemological claim in this passage, and I think it represents a core theme, a principle within Socrates' philosophy more generally, which is, this admission to ignorance. Socrates seems to possess wisdom insofar as he knows nothing. At least that was according to the Oracle of Delphi. Socrates, of course, sought to confirm or disconfirm the oracle's claim that Socrates was the wisest man in the land. And so, I think we could raise some questions. What is Socrates' wisdom in this regard? Is it, theoretical wisdom, or is it practical wisdom? What are the theoretical and practical consequences of Socrates' wisdom? His admission to ignorance, and what's the value of consciously acknowledging one's ignorance in that regard? So I know that was sort of a densely packed passage there, and I really tried to unpack a lot of what was going on there. But how does this sit with you, Ryan, at this point?
Yeah, I think it. I've been focusing on Epicurus and his philosophy, and it seems to fit just nicely with one another, the two philosophies and the two attitudes, at least from sort of like an epistemological sense. What attitude we're supposed to kind of have towards death, and what can we know about it. So I guess it's kind of ethical and epistemological. So the quote that I grabbed actually from Epicurus that I think relates to this really well. It says, "The many at one moment shun death as the greatest of evils. At another, they yearn for it as a respite from the evils in life. So the wise man neither seeks to escape life nor fears the cessation of life. For neither does life offend him, nor does the absence of life seem to be any evil." So he seems to be poking at two different attitudes that he's saying are wrong. And what he's saying is that people who think that something great's going to come after life or in death, or something terrible is going to happen after life or in death, those are the wrong attitudes to have, because we don't know. And I think that's what Socrates is saying. So like having an attitude one way or the other, I think that's where problems for our life here and now leak in. I think in one sense, if you feel like death is this horrible thing, you're going to sit there with this death anxiety. But if you think death is great, well, then you're maybe not going to be living the most, or acting the most considerately or wisely in the here and the now either, if you think there's some better, more beautiful afterlife. So I think the right attitude, the philosophical attitude that's being preached by Epicurus and Socrates here is sort of this philosophical attitude of indifference towards death.
Right. Yeah.